Chapter 19. Garments. Man is a tool-using animal. Weak in himself, and of small stature, he stands on a basis, at most for the flattest soled, of some half-square foot, insecurely enough, has to straddle out his legs, lest the very wind supplant him. Feeblest of bipeds. 3 quintals are a crushing load for him, the stir of the meadow tosses him aloft, like a waste rag. Nevertheless he can use tools, can devise tools, with his the granite mountain melts into light dust before him, he needs glowing iron as if it were paste, Caesar his smooth highway, winds and fire his unwearying steeds. Nowhere do you find him without tools he is nothing, with tools he is all. Man is a tool-using animal, of which truth, clothes are but one example. Sartori Sartus. In looking through the records of man's achievements to find the beginnings of inventions, we discover the glimmering of a change in the form of the immemorial needle, in an English patent granted to Charles F. Weissenthal, June 24, 1775. It was a needle with a centrally located eye, and with both ends pointed, designed for embroidery work by hand, and the object of the 2 points was to prevent the turning of the needle end for end after its passage through the cloth. But it was not until the 19th century that the idea was reduced to practice in sewing machines. To Thomas Saint, a cabinet maker by trade, of Greenhills Rents, in the parish of St. Sepulchre, Middlesex County, England, the world is indebted for the first clear conception of a sewing machine. Saint's attention was attracted to the slow way of sewing boots and shoes and other leather work, so he determined to improve the method. He took out a patent September 17, 1790, and although the germs of some of the leading parts of the modern sewing machine are there described, it does not appear that his patent was applied to practice. In fact, it slumbered in the archives of the British Patent Office for 2 generations, and after the leading sewing machines of the century had been invented and introduced, before it was rediscovered, and its contents appreciated in the light of more recent developments. Probably Saint's machine, if constructed in accordance with his plans, would not have done much good work, certainly not with woven cloth, as he proposed to employ a hooked needle to carry a loop through the material, which would have been snarled by the cloth threads. But from his drawings and description, it is clearly established that he was first to conceive of a vertically reciprocating needle, for forming a seam from a continuous thread drawn from a spool, a seam in which each loop is locked, or enchained with a subsequent loop, to form what is known as the chain, or single thread stitch, and a horizontal sliding plate, to support the material to be sewed, and by which the material was also moved sideways after each stitch. May 30, 1804, John Duncan received an English patent for tampering on cloth. He proposed to employ a series of hooked needles attached in a straight line to a horizontal bar, which, when threaded, were first thrust forward, and their hooked ends carried through the cloth, where each needle hook was supplied with a thread by a thread carrier. Then the motion of the bar was reversed, which drew the thread back through the cloth in the form of loops, and through the loops first formed, thus producing a chain stitch. The cloth was automatically shifted to correspond to the pattern to be produced, and thus was chain stitch embroidery first manufactured. From this point of time successful embroidery machines were made. In 1807 another Englishman patented a machine for making a sort of rope matting, in which he describes 2 eye-pointed thread-carrying perforating needles, each held in a reciprocating needle bar, and designed to unite several small ropes laid parallel, by reciprocating movement. A German publication, the Kunstgenerblatt, for 1817, and Karmisch's History of Technology, made mention of a sewing machine invented by one Mr. Joseph Mattersberger of Vienna, formerly from Kufstein in the Tyrol, and for which he received royal letters patent in 1814. From his descriptions it appears Mattersberger used a needle pointed at both ends, and the eye in the center, invented many years before by Weissenthal, as above stated, which was moved vertically up and down, piercing alternately the top and bottom of the stuff, and which carried a short thread, enough to make about 130 stitches, which machine was driven by a crank and handle, on which sewing was made of many different shaped forms, by slight changes, and which sewed with far greater accuracy and rapidity than handwork. The inventor was striving to simplify the machine, but to what extent it had been used or had been improved, or what finally became of it, does not appear. Yet it is a bit of evidence showing that Germany came next to England in the earlier ideas, conceptions of, and struggles after a sewing machine. France then entered the list, and it was in 1830 that Barthélemy Thiminier there produced and patented a sewing machine, which he continued to improve and to further patent in 1848 and in 1850 in France, England, and the United States. The Thiminier resembled in some prominent respects the machine that had been described in the Saint patent, but unlike Saint's, it was reduced to successful practice and possessed some points in common with more modern machines. These were the flat cloth plate, vertical post, overhung arm, vertically reciprocating needle, and continuous thread. The crochet or barbed needle was worked by a treadle, and upon pushing the needle down through the cloth, it there caught a thread from the carrier, carried the loop to, and laid it upon the upper surface of the cloth. Again descending, it brought up another loop, enchained it with the one last made, making a chain stitch, consisting of a series of loops on the upper side. Thiminier made quite a large number of machines, constructed mostly of wood, and which were used to make army clothing at Paris. They were best adapted to work on leather and in embroidering. They were so far successful as to arouse the jealousy and fear of a workman and working women, and, as in the case of Hargreaves, Jackwood, and others, a mob broke into his shop, destroyed his machines, ruined his business, and he died penniless in 1857. In the meantime, an English patent, number 8948, of May 4, 1841, had been issued to Newton and Archbold for a machine for embroidering the backs of gloves, having an eye-pointed needle, worked by a vibrating lever, and adapted to carry a thread through the back of the glove, held on a frame, the frame and glove moving together after each stitch. The germs of inventions often develop and fructify simultaneously in distant places, without, so far as anyone can ascertain, the slightest mutual knowledge or cooperation on the part of the separate inventors. Between 1832 and 1834, while Thiminier was in the midst of his early struggles in Paris, Walter Hunt was inventing a sewing machine in New York, which he completed at that time, and on which he sewed 1 or 2 garments. But as it was experimental in form, and Hunt was full of other inventions and schemes, he put it aside, and it probably would never have been heard of had not Elias Howe of Massachusetts, 10 years after Hunt had abandoned his invention, but without knowledge of Hunt's efforts, made the first practical successful sewing machine for commercial purposes the world had ever seen, obtained his patent, and made claims therein which covered not only his special form of improvements, but Hunt's old device as well. Howe's patent was issued September 10, 1846. In that he claimed to be the first and original inventor of a sewing machine, constructed and operated to form a seam, substantially as described. Also the combination of a needle and a shuttle, or equivalent, and holding surfaces, constructed and operating substantially as described. Also the combination of holding surfaces with a baster plate or equivalent, constructed and operating substantially as described. Also a grooved and eye-pointed needle, constructed and adapted for rapid machine sewing substantially as described. When the machine commenced to be a practical success, this patent was infringed, and when Howe sued upon it a few years after its issue, it woke up Hunt and all other alleged prior inventors, and all prior patents and publications the world over, relating to sewing machines, were aped up to defeat Howe's claims. But the courts, after long deliberation, held that although, so far as Hunt was concerned, he had without doubt made a machine in many respects like Howe's machine, that it had a curved eye-pointed needle similar to Howe's, operated by a vibrating arm and going through the cloth, a shuttle carrying the thread that passed through the loop made by the needle thread, thus making a lock stitch, by drawing it up to one side of the cloth, and that this machine did, to a certain extent, so, yet that it ended in an experiment, was laid aside, destroyed, and never perfected, nor used so as to give to the public the knowledge and benefit of a completed invention, and was not therefore an anticipation in the eye of the law of Howe's completed, more successful and patented machine. Public successful use is the fact in many cases which alone establishes the title of an inventor, when all other tests fail. And this is right in one sense, as the laws of all countries in respect to protection by patents for inventions are based upon the primary condition of benefit to society. This benefit is not derived from the inventor who hides his completed invention for years in his closet, or throws it on a dust heap. As to previous patents and publications, some were not published before Howe's inventions were made, and others were insufficient in showing substantially the same machine and mode of operation. and as to prior use abroad, it was not regarded under the law of his country as competent evidence. Seldom have the lives of great inventors presented a more striking example of the vicissitudes, the despair, and the final triumphs of fortune, which are commonly their lot, than is shown in the case of Howe. A machinist with a wife and children to support, has health too feeble to earn hardly a scanty living. He watches his faithful wife ply her constant needle, and wonders why a machine cannot be made to do the work. The idea cannot be put aside, and with such parades as he can command he commences his task. At last, amid the trials of bitter poverty, he brings his invention to that stage in which he induces a friend to advance some money, by the promise of a share in the future patent, and thereby gains a temporary home for his family and a garret for his workshop. Day after day and night after night he labors, and finally, in April 1845, the rather crude machine is completed, and 2 woolen suits of clothing are sewed thereon, one for a friend, and one for himself. Then came the effort to make more machines and place them on the market. People admired the machines as a curiosity, but none were induced to buy them or help him pecuniarily. Finally, in September 1846, he obtained his patent, but by that time his best friends had become discouraged, and he was compelled to return with his family to his father's house in Cambridge, Mass. To earn his bread he sought and found employment on a railway locomotive. By some means his brothers sold one of his machines to Mr. William Thomas, a corset maker of London, and Howe was induced to go there to make stays, and his machines. He took his wife and children with him. The arrangement made with his employer was not such as to enable him to keep his family there, and he soon sent them home. Unable to sell his machines, he was soon reduced to want. He pawned his patent and his last machine, and procured money to return to New York, where he arrived penniless in 1849. He then learned that his wife was dying of consumption at Cambridge. He was compelled to wait until money could be sent him to pay his passage home, and reached there just before his wife's death. He then learned that during his absence his patent and machine had attracted attention, that others had taken the matter up, added their improvements to his machines, and that many in various places were being made and sold which were infringements of his patent. A great demand for sewing machines had sprung up. He induced friends to again help him. Suits were commenced which, although bitterly fought for 6 years, were finally successful. Now fortune turned her smiling face upon him. Medals and diplomas, the Cross of the Legion of Honor, and millions of money became his. When the Great Civil War broke out in 1861, he entered the army as a private soldier, and advanced the money to pay the regiment to which he belonged, when the government paymaster had been long delayed. His life was saddened by the fact that his wife had not lived to share his fortune. He died in Brooklyn, New York, October 3, 1867, in the midst of life, riches, and honor, at the comparatively early age of 48. In referring to the early inventors of sewing machines in America who entered the field about the same time with Howe, mention should be made of J. Greenough and George Corliss, who had machines patented respectively in 1842 and 1843, for sewing leather, with double-pointed needles, and the running stitch sewing machine used for basting, made and patented by B.W. Bean in 1843. About this time, both in England and America, machines had been devised for sewing lengths of calico and other cloths together, previous to bleaching, dyeing or printing. The edges of the cloths were first crimped or fluted, and then sewed by a running stitch. The decade of 1849 to 1859, immediately following the development of the Howe machine, was the greatest in the century for producing those successful sewing machines which were the foundation of the art, established a new industrial epoch, and converted Hood's Song of a Shirt into a lament commemorative of the miseries of a slavish but dying industry. It was during that decade that, in the United States, Batcher invented the perpetual feed for moving the cloth horizontally under and past the needle. In Howe's the cloth could be sewed but a certain distance at a time, and then the machine must be readjusted for a new length. Then Blodgett and Leroux imparted to the eye-pointed needle what's called the dip motion, the needle being made to descend completely through the material, then to rise a little to form a loop. The shuttle then entered the loop, the needle descended again a short distance, while a shuttle passed through the loop of the needle thread, and then the needle was raised above the cloth. It was then that Allen B. Wilson invented the still more famous four-motion feed, for feeding the cloth forward. He employed a bar having saw-like teeth on one edge, which projected up through a slotted plate and engaged the cloth. He then first moved the bar forward carrying the cloth, second, dropped the bar, third, moved it back under the plate, and fourth, raised it to his first position to again engage the cloth. These motions were so timed with the movement of the needle and so quickly done that the cloth was carried forward while the needle was raised, the passage and quick action of the needle was not interfered with, and the feeding and the sewing seemed to be simultaneous. The intermittent grasp and feed of the cloth were hardly perceptible, and yet it permitted the cloth to be turned to make a curved seam. Wilson also invented the rotating hook which catches the loop of the upper thread and drops a disc bobbin through it to form a stitch. The shuttle was thus dispensed with, and an entirely new departure was made in the art. These with other improvements made up the celebrated Wheeler and Wilson machine. Now also appeared the Singer, consisting chiefly of the invention of T.M. Singer. He improved the operation of the needle bar, devised a roughened feed wheel as a substitute for Wilson's serrated bar, introduced a spring presser foot alongside the needle to hold the work down in proper position while permitting it to be moved forward or in any other direction. A friction pad was also placed between the cloth seam and the spool to prevent the thread from kinking or twisting under the point of the descending needle. He was the first to give the shuttle an additional forward movement after it had once stopped to draw the stitch tight, such operation being taken while the feed moved the cloth in the reverse direction and while the needle completed its upward motion, so that the two threads were simultaneously drawn, and finally a spring guide upon the shuttle to control the slack of the thread and prevent its catching by the needle. By reason of these improvements it is thought by many that Singer was the first to furnish the people with a successful operating and practical sewing machine. At any rate, the world at last so highly appreciated his machines that it lifted him from poverty to an estate which was valued at between $8 and $10 million at the time of his death in 1875. Singer was also the first to invent the ruffler, a machine for ruffling or gathering cloth, and a device which laid an embroidering thread upon the surface of the cloth under the needle thread. The Grover and Baker, another celebrated American machine, was invented by William O. Grover and William E. Baker in 1851. By certain changes they made in the thread carrier and connections, they were enabled to make a double loop stitch. This required more thread, but the stitch made was unexcelled in strength. And so the work went on, from step to step, and from the completion of one machine after another, until when the Centennial Exhibition came to be held in Philadelphia in 1876, a fine array of excellent sewing machines was had, from the United States principally, but also those of inventors and manufacturers in Great Britain, Canada, France, Germany, Belgium, Sweden and Denmark. Up to that time about 2,200 patents had been granted in the United States, all of which, with the exception of a very few, were for inventions made within the preceding quarter of a century. And during the last quarter of the century, about 5,000 more United States patents have been issued for devices in this art. This number includes many, of course, to inventors of other countries. When it is remembered that these patents were issued only after an examination in each case as to its novelty, and although slight as may have been the changes or additions, yet substantially different they must have been in nearly all respects, it may to some extent be realized how great and incessant has been the exercise of invention in this useful class of machines. On this point of the exercise of invention in sewing machines, as well as on some others growing out of the subject, Knight, writing in his Mechanical Dictionary, about 20 years ago, remarks, "If required to name the three subjects on which the most extraordinary versatility of invention has been expended, the answer would be without hesitation, the sewing machine, reaping machine and breech-loading firearm." Each of these has thousands of patents, and although each is the growth of the last 40 years, it is only during the last 25 years that they have filled any notable place in the world. It was then only by a combination of talents that any of these three important inventions was enabled to achieve remarkable success. The sewing machine previous to 1851, made without the admirable division of labor which is a feature in all well-conducted factories, was hard to make, and comparatively hard to run. The system of assembling, first introduced in the artillery service of France by General Graboville in 1765, and brought approximate perfection by Colonel Colt in the manufacture of the revolver at Hartford, Connecticut, has economized material and time, improved the quality as well as cheapened the product. There is today, and in fact has been for some years, more actual invention in the special machines for making sewing machines than in the machines themselves. The assembling system, that is, making the component parts of an article in distinct pieces of pattern, so as to be interchangeable, and the putting them together, is the only system of order. How else should the Providence Tool Company execute their order for 600,000 rifles for the Turkish government? How otherwise could the Champion Harvesting Machine Company of Springfield, Ohio, turn out an equipped machine every 4 minutes each working day of 10 hours? Or, to draw the illustration from the subject in hand, how by any other than the nicest arrangement of detail, can the Singer Sewing Machine Company make 6,000 machines per week at Elizabethport, New Jersey? When sewing machines were so far completed as to be easily run by a hand crank or treadle, the application of power to run them singly or in series, and to run machines of a larger and more powerful description, soon naturally followed, so that garment-making factories of all kinds, whether of cloth or leather, have been established in many countries in which steam or electric power is utilized as the motor, and thus human strain and labor saved, while the amount of production is increased. No radical changes in the principle or mode of operation of sewing machines have been made in the last 25 years, but the efforts of inventors have been directed to improve the previously established types, and to devise attachments of all kinds, by the aid of which anything that can be sewed upon a machine. Tucking, ruffling, braiding, cording, hemming, turning, plaiting, gauging, and other attachment devices are numerous. Inventors have rivaled one another in originating new forms of stitches. About 75 distinct stitches have been devised, each of which must of course be produced by a change in mechanism. When sewing machines were in their infancy, and confined to sewing straight seams and other plain sewing, it was predicted that it was not possible to take from the hands of women the making of fine embroidery from intricate patterns, or the working of buttonholes, and the destruction of the quilting party was not apprehended. Nor was it expected that human hands could be dispensed with in the cutting out of garments. And yet these things have followed. Machines, by a beautiful but complex system of needles, working to some extent on the jackwood system of perforated cardboards, and by the help of pneumatic or electrical power, will work out on most delicate cloths embroidery of exquisite patterns. The buttonhole machines will take the garment, cut the buttonhole at the desired point, and either, as in one class of machines, by moving the fabric about the stitch-forming mechanism, or, as in another class, moving the stitch-forming mechanism about the buttonhole, complete the delicate task in the nicest and most effective manner. Quilting machines have their own bees, consisting of a guide which regulates the spaces between the seams, and adjusts them to any width, and a single needle, or gang of needles, the latter under the control of cams, which force the needles to quilt certain desired patterns. And as to cutting, it is only necessary to place the number of pieces of fabric desired to be cut in cutting dies, or upon a table, and over them an overboard cutter, which comprises a reciprocating bandsaw, or a rotary knife, all quick, keen and delicate, in an apparatus guided by hand, in order to produce in the operation a great pile of the parts formerly so slowly produced, one at a time, by scissors or shears. If men were contented with that single useful garment of some savages, a blanket with a slit cut in it for the passage of the head and neck, not only would a vast portion of the joys and sorrows of social philosophy have been avoided, but an immense strain and trouble on the part of inventors of the century would have been obviated. But man's propensity for wearing clothes has led to the invention of every variety of tools for making them faster, cheaper, and better. No machine has yet been invented that will take the place of the deft fingers of women in certain lines of ornamentation, as in final completion and trimming of the hats. The airy and erratic demands of fashion are too nimble to be supplied by the slow processes of machinery, although the crude groundwork, the frame, has been shaped, molded and sewed by machines, and women themselves have invented and patented bonnet frames and patterns. But no such difficulty in invention has occurred in hat making for men. From the treating and cutting of the raw material, from the outer bound edge and the band about the body, to the tip of the crown, a machine may be found for performing each separate step. Especially is this the case with the hard felt and the high silk hats. 75 years ago the making of hats was by hand processes. Now in all hat factories machines are employed, and the ingenuity displayed in the construction of some of them is marvelous. It is exceedingly difficult to find many of the old hand implements existing even as relics. Wool and fur each has its special machines for turning it into a hat. The operations of cleaning and preparing the material, felting the fur when fur is used, shaping the hat body and then the brim, washing, dyeing, hardening and stiffening it, stretching, smoothing, finishing, sizing, lining, trimming, all are now done by machines devised for each special purpose. A description of these processes would be interesting, but even in an abbreviated form would fill a book. The wonderful things done in the manufacture of boots and shoes and rubber goods will be referred to in subsequent chapters. Although it was old from time immemorial to color cotton goods, and the calico power printing cylinder was invented and introduced into England in the latter part of the 18th century, and began to turn out at once immense quantities of decorated calicos and chintz, yet figured woven goods were a novelty 60 years ago. In 1834, Mr. Bonjou, a prominent wool manufacturer in Sedan, France, and an élève of the Polytechnic School, conceived the idea of modifying the plain cloths, universally made, by the union of different tints and patterns. This he was enabled to do by the jacquard loom. The manufacture of fancy woven cloths, cassimires, worsted coatings, etc., of great beauty, combined with strength of fabrication, followed in all civilized countries, but their universal adoption as wearing apparel was due in part to the lessening of the expense in the making them into garments by the sewing machine. As to the effect of modern inventions on wearing apparel, it is not apparent that they were necessary to supply the wardrobes of the rich. The Solomons and the Queen of Sheba of ancient days, and all their small and great successors in the halls of fortune, have had their rich robes, their purple and their fine linen, whether made in one way or another. But modern inventions have banished the day when the poor man's hard labor of a long day will not suffice to bring his wife a yard of cheapest cloth. Toil, then, as hard as he and his poor wife and children might, the united labors would hardly suffice to clothe them in more than the poly-dressed skins of animals, and the coarsest of homespun wool. Now, cottons and calicos are made and sold at a profit for 3 cents a yard, and the poorest woman in the land may appear in neat, comfortable and tasteful dress, the entire cost of material and labor of which need not exceed 50 cents. The comfort, respectability and dignity of a large family, which depend so much on clothes, may be insured at the cost of a few dollars. And as to the condition of the sewing woman, trying and poor as it is in many instances, yet she can earn more money with less physical exhaustion than under the old system. The epoch of good clothes for the people, with all that it means in the fight upward from degradation, began in this century, and it was due to the inventions which have been above outlined.